Thank you to the panel for opening up the report from a range of perspectives and views that are discussed in the report. Now it's your opportunity to respond with a question to one of our panelists or your own comment from your own perspective on the subject of migration and displacement. Could I just ask that when you do speak, you identify who you are and if you represent an organisation, to tell us which organisation that is, and to wave, and there'll be a microphone floating around so we can all hear. So the floor is open.
All right, I'm Jeremy Wetterwald. I work with Amnesty International, and I recently conducted some research on migration and displacement. And one of the questions that one of the answers that I wasn't able to find, and I think it's going to be you, Roger Zetter, that's going to be concerned, is when does displacement end? No researchers were really able of pinpointing what is the objective, what is the end point, like humanitarian aid to forced migration and resettlement. What is the final objective? So basically, when does displacement end?
Okay, and while you're there, a question immediately coming from your neighbour.
I'm Saman Haysam. I'm a research officer with HPG at ODI and one of the contributors to the report. I have a question for anyone who would like to answer it. Maybe Nando, it speaks more to what you've been talking about, but I was really pleased to see the inclusion in the report of some of the ideas around mobility and different ways to solve protracted displacement. And at the same time, a lot of those ideas seem to be quite far away from dominant political ideas about migration and citizenship. And I would be interested to hear how you think that the humanitarian sector or other actors can contribute to promoting those ideas.
Okay, and we'll take another question from this side over there. One more question, and then we'll let the panel respond and then take another round.
Hi, I'm Laura Bletcher from the British Institute of International Comparative Law. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your findings on how climate change and the environment impact on forced displacement.
We can't hear.
We can't hear at this end of the room.
I think it's off mic. Okay. That
Just project.
okay.
My question was just about how the role of climate change and environment on forced migration.
Okay, so the impact of climate change and environmental change on forced migration. So we'll respond to those. So hold any other questions and think of some more along the way. So first of all, Roger, can you respond to the question from Jeremy on when does displacement end?
It's a remarkably timely question because last Thursday I gave the opening seminar perhaps you were there even, in a seminar series in the university called Migrant Journeys. And that kind of theme of when does a journey start and when does it end was very much kind of the kind of subtext, if you like, of the presentation. So, I mean, to respond to your question here, I think there are three dimensions, really, of displacement, if one thinks of the individual. There's the displacement when it begins, when it ends in the mind. I mean, we think of kind of crisis migration, people moving spontaneously and instantly. In fact, the reality is that most forced migrations decisions and forced migrants are actually quite well strategized and quite thought out. Only in very extreme circumstances, at the sort of end of a barrel of a gun, do people flee. But migration, forced migration, is sometimes actually a very positive adaptation strategy, not a reactive response of last resort. So one thing I think then is in the mind. When does it begin? And specifically your question, when does displacement end in the mind? In some cases, if you take Palestinian refugees, it doesn't. 4 generations later, the mindset is displacement is still what motivates and activates the political discourse of Palestinian nation. I think the second dimension is when does it end materially in terms of a kind of the classic UNHCR definition of the past, sort of when refugees have reached the same level of economic and social activity as the host population. That is integration in the end. And I think the third dimension of when it ends is really the institutional, and by that I mean where the humanitarian agencies and the development agencies work together. As I said, I think the key is when humanitarian and development agendas speak to each other, and that grafting, it seems to me, of humanitarian actors responding more with a developmental lens, and increasingly developmental actors, as they are beginning to do, the World Bank, for example, beginning to look at humanitarian agendas. So, when does displacement end? I don't think one can create a kind of finite end point because of those three dimensions, and every household, every individual forced migrant, whether they're from a disaster or whether they're refugees, whether they have the capacity to return. I think those three dimensions are a very complex conjuncture. And I don't think it ends in terms of the three classic durable solutions, as we know, and as part of the report argues very cogently. The three classic durable solutions of return, resettlement and integration. None of them work effectively. Take last year, for example, of the 800,000 refugees who were requested third country resettlement, only 80,000 were resettled. So less than 10% of those are actually on the official list, let alone those who are not on the official list. And most of those actually come from refugee communities that are seen as sort of benign and receptive, Bhutanese refugees rather than sort of Syrians and refugees from the Islamic world, for example. So I think displacement, in a sense, there's no definable end point. But I think from the operational point of view, and what the report, I think, stresses, is that we need to find new ways of unlocking protracted displacement, even if that only addresses the economic and livelihood needs of people who are displaced. What happens in the mind, I think, is very different.
Can I just add a little comment to this? So it's also important, I think, to bear in mind that different communities will have very different, sort of ideas about whether their displacement has ended or not. And within the same community, you'll have very different perspectives. And we found that in the study on urban displacement in Khartoum, where there were part of the long-term IDPs that very much wanted to be still defined as IDPs because that carried, some political implications as well as assistance benefits. But another quite substantive, part that actually really rejected the use of the label, and he felt it was a label that carried a stigma that didn't really allow them to feel 100% as Sudanese citizens. And the views on this were very polarized, even if people came from a similar experience of this displacement and, similar sort of time in displacement.
Nando, can you give some perspectives and thoughts on this challenge of how do we create a more politically enabling environment for some of the ideas and innovations such as mobility and other solutions that are being proposed in the report?
It's a big question, and I think I will very happily give it the words to Roger for this one.
Can I pop? I'll have a go after you.
I think there is an issue there of trying to, for the fascinating of the kind of work Roger has been doing is the fact of trying to convey a large body of academic work into what it is meant to be a more accessible policy instrument, and I think there is a big value into this. The idea that we need somehow also to translate in the various languages and talk into the various audiences and make sure that somehow some sort of thoughts become more operationalized, and this is clearly a move in that direction, which is extremely important. And I also think that the way that one of the limitations sometimes of the work that the academic we do is the fact of is when we set as the end of our job. Our job somehow finished when we finish the report, and then it's up to the people to use it. Instead, we should make more an effort of accompanying the work and start to. So in this way, I think this report is a clear move in that direction.
Yeah. In many ways, I think that photograph and Nando's presentation, I think, just crystallized a lot of the kind of political contradictions that take place at national and supranational level within the European Union and most other industrialized countries. So it is a formidable challenge. I think what this report and what a lot of other research shows, and sort of ironically, is that many of the things we were proposing, particularly to unlock protracted displacement, sort of more relaxed attitudes to employment in countries of refuge, cross-border mobility, progressive modes of citizenship or integration, is actually what people are doing, actually completely outside the institutional and legal fabric of what kind of status they have in a particular country. I mean, as Sarah was saying, in the urban context, refugees, IDPs go to urban areas for all kinds of reasons. Most of them are reasons to actually be delabelled and not be a protected refugee for all kinds of reasons. They go there to seek much more stable economic livelihoods and opportunities, despite government's resistance to that process and repatriating refugees or trying to sort of round up refugees in Nairobi and send them back to Dadaab or whatever. So I think and then a lot of the cross-border movements by refugees, which I mentioned from Iraq, from Syria, but before the current crisis, but going backwards and forwards to Iraq and so on. So, you know, a lot of the reality of what displaced people do on the ground is completely out of kilter with what the norms expect a refugee to do and how they expect to behave. And I think that one fundamental political challenge is to kind of reconcile that disconnect. I think the second challenge, and I think this is much more difficult, both in our sort of European context and indeed the countries that host the 4/5 of displaced people, is how you address the political rhetoric. I mean, what politician in Europe has stood up and spoken powerfully for refugees in the last 5 or 10 years? Absolutely zilch. I'll stand corrected on that, but I can't think of any. And in fact, the discourse is really going the other way. And I think the bigger challenge for international organisations, for the Red Cross, I'm not singling them out, but I think for all of us involved in the humanitarian world, is this relentless advocacy that we've got to do to change the mindset of populations. And in many ways it should be easier in Europe because we're more privileged, we have more resources and fewer refugees, trying to change the mindset, let's say, for example, of citizens in Kenya with very large numbers of refugees in 2 main camps and in the cities. That is an even more prodigious challenge. But there I think the obligation is on the industrialised world to provide the kind of support and the underwriting of assistance to refugees in a much more consolidated and proactive way. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I think what we see is a kind of peaking of international assistance. It's around about $7, $8, $9 billion, just the DAC component of that. Is pretty static. Yet the nature of the crises and the dimension of the crises are becoming that they need more funding. It's easy to say that, but that funding needs to be better targeted, I think, to some of the long-term strategies to support refugees, the majority of whom are in protracted displacement.
And Roger, a very brief comment. What does the report say about the impact of climate change and environmental change on migration?
It says two things. The first, and perhaps the most important, and in a sense sort of challenging, I think, a lot of the kind of, again, the political rhetoric that climate change equals refugees. What my research, and by no means I'm the only one working in this area, what the evidence shows is that climate change and severe environmental conditions precipitate displacement, but only where there are already existing vulnerabilities, livelihood vulnerabilities, or political fragility, or the rights of individuals and households in local communities are not fully represented and articulated. People who are powerless in any context are vulnerable. And what climate change does, except in the obvious sort of examples of a kind of natural disaster like Fukushima, but where you've got slow onset disaster, where it's very, very hard to sort of relate an event to a trajectory of movement. But the reality, so the first point is that climate change in the context of other variables, which I think makes the second point much more difficult then to challenge. What do humanitarian development actors do about it? I think a number of things. First of all, much greater emphasis on adaptation and resilience. I mean, that, I think, resonates and chimes with the precepts of the Federation National Societies. I mean, it's core to their sort of precepts and values. But looking at adaptation and resilience and developing much more sort of long-term policies of disaster risk reduction which anticipate changing climatic hazards, particularly rising sea levels. Supporting the livelihoods in areas where, for example, salination in countries like Bangladesh are diminishing the environmental capacity of particularly coastal areas and the productive capacity, and droughts as well, looking at ways of supporting and providing alternative livelihoods. Advocacy, I think, is absolutely crucial, and promoting of rights. Very few people represent the rights of people who are in environments which make them susceptible to migration. So I think there has to be a lot more support. One takes an example, perhaps an extreme example of a country like Vietnam, where, depending on which national strategy you read, something in the order of 150,000 households, or maybe twice that number, are going to be relocated in the next 5 years from the most flood-prone areas of the Mekong Delta. What rights do those people have? Okay, it's a one-party state, it's an extreme example, but I think it's not actually that much different from countries like Bangladesh and other countries susceptible to climate change and displacement. How are these people empowered? What rights do they have to participate in the relocation strategies? What kinds of compensation and effective sort of support for them takes place? And I think humanitarian and development organisations have a very powerful advocacy role. And I think the fourth point is that very often migration is seen as the kind of default, it's seen as the kind of reaction, it's seen as the kind of failure, if you like, of development. But I think what we say in the report in this context, but in other contexts as well, migration, even under the most extreme situations of conflict and violence, is not just a survival strategy, it's an active strategy that households engage to diversify their income, to try and support the continuity of income in a household by perhaps one or two family members moving across the border, the rest staying, albeit in very vulnerable situations. And I think the same applies to environment and climate change as well, where that is a factor that precipitates mobility. That adaptation, I think, is not just a reaction, not just a strategy of survival. It is an active representation of the agency of migrants, even in the most extreme circumstances. And I think, again, that's what it's not there, but that's what that photograph is about on the front.
A final one or two questions. One from the gentleman at the back, and then there's... we'll take both of them. We'll do our best to respond, but at least you've had the opportunity to ask your question. So,
hi, I'm Beniden Betzer. I'm a Marxist in the sense that I don't belong to any organization that will have me. A Groucho Marxist. My question relates very much to the last point, if I may. Look at the Sahelian belt. There is an historical phenomenon which is unstoppable. More and more groups of people, even formerly settled communities, are now becoming migrant again. I think the World Bank gave it the name of reverse genesis, with all kind of biblical connotations. Surely there is absolutely nothing that one can do to prevent the historical movement of all the peoples along the Sahel further south. Already in the last 3 years, an estimated 6 million people have moved from Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, down to the Ivory Coast and further southern countries. I just wonder if there is any solution whatsoever to that problem.
thank you. Morris, and then the gentleman behind you. Morris.
I can probably shout for
Yep.
louder than I can do it through the microphone. It's for our online audience. Oh, okay. My name is Morris Hurston. I'm one of the editors of Forced Migration Review. Thank you for the presentation. It saved me reading a lot of the report. I haven't managed to read much of it yet. One of the interesting things that, if I can do a bit of shameless promotion, one of the things that Forced Migration Review is interested in at the moment is actually prevention of migration. And there's a lot of resonances I've heard in your presentations. I mean, Roger talking about how people don't suddenly move, but actually there's a lot of decision-making that goes on in a long process, for example. That's one of the things that has come out in some of the articles that have been sent to us. But at the same time, I've been struck by the number of people whose solution to the potential for displacement has been, well, there's a war, and if the war would stop, then people wouldn't move. Actually, there's very little emphasis in our thinking about how we work with people in making those decisions about whether or not they migrate. And we've given it the title of preventing displacement, which is a bit of an extreme view of it. But I think it's an interesting dimension that has come more and more to me. There was the floods in Thailand, for example. The people who chose to stick them out and the people who chose to block up their houses and move, even in the short term, and it's a situation where they could expect to go back relatively quickly and not be a protracted displacement, those sorts of situations and the way we work with people in making those decisions and managing their displacement, as opposed to being, in some sense, forced at a point when they don't need to be or shouldn't be.
Okay, thank you, Maurice. And final question, comment from the person behind you.
Thank you. My name is Nzita. I'm an independent researcher. Thank you for your report here. But I would like to point out 2 or 3 things here. The lack of perspective for this particular issue, and what can we learn from Europe. If you look at forced migration has been a cause of peace in Europe, in particular the displacement of German minorities from the Carpats, from the Sudeten into Germany. So they were, these Germans were first voluntary migrants to Eastern Europe, then they become a forced immigrant in order to generate peace in Europe. Can you develop a bit about it?
Okay, I'm going to just throw in 2 comments that have been fed in from some of our participants online, and I'm going to say to everyone that regrettably we won't be able to answer all these questions or comments, but would encourage you to read the report where you will find the answers to all of your questions. But the 2 questions that have come, one from Christine Manson from Homeland Security USA: what is being done to predict human migrations? I see that these kinds of studies may help us prepare for pandemics in refugee environments. Another question from Twitter, Alison from the organisation Killing Architects, a studio for research and design in the fields of architecture and urbanism. Given the importance of governance in urban areas, what recommendation does the report make for strengthening local government in emergencies? I regret we're not going to have an opportunity to discuss all of these interesting comments and questions, but I'm going to just ask each of our panellists to give a final comment to leave us, and as I said, we'll hopefully encourage you to go away and think further as you read the report on some of the challenging issues. So, first of all, Nando.
I think I would like to close with a reference to agency. I think Roger has been mentioning quite a few times. I think it's important. And the example that I think is very telling is to think about how long it took, for example, for Libyan nationals or Syrian nationals to leave their countries during the war. I mean, in a sense, the first that left, especially for Libya, were first the migrants that moved out, and then later on the nation. So there is this sense of deciding when to move. And the decision about migration is a crucial element to understand. Also in a situation of limited option as a war or conflict or disaster, which is something that we really should bear in mind when addressing this issue. And the other aspect is about agency in a different way, in a way acknowledging the fact that migration itself can cause transformation and change, and the governance of migration has affected the uprising in a way. One of the points I try to make in the box is about the fact that once all the entry routes to Europe were closed, when it was no longer possible to apply for asylum in Europe, or it's still extremely difficult to apply or to migrate towards Europe, at that point there has been an increased unhappiness of the youth, of the middle class in North Africa, and people have started to mobilize. This is also a way to see one of the, always been really mobilizing during the Arab Springs. So you would see actually there is a kind of a long-term or medium-term impact of the policies we apply to migration on the stabilization or transformation. Some people may think it's actually a great thing that there has been the uprising, but still you can not only reflect on the impact of the uprising and migration in relation to Europe only looking at the after or the consequences. Actually, we should think in a more holistic way also to how our previous policies on migration and governance can affect what happened in the region. So it's a more complex dynamics there.
Thanks, Nandos.
Well, how to respond and summarise 250 pages, and I was counting the other day, I commissioned 51 authors to write in this report, but how to consolidate that incredible range of expertise and knowledge. And I'd say 2 points, and one is just to add a footnote to Nando's point about sort of who arrived at the borders of Libya. The first people to arrive were the migrants, and the first gender to arrive were the men. It was the women and children who arrived 6 to 10 weeks later. And I think that speaks volumes for one of the core elements of this report about vulnerability. Who's vulnerable? How do we define that vulnerability? How does that vulnerability interact with the dynamics of particular forced displacement situations, which are different again in Syria, certainly different again, say, in the Horn of Africa, different again in Colombia. There's a very interesting box here about displacement in Colombia, and particularly displacement of IDPs to urban areas, focusing particularly on women, and showing how the reconfiguration of women's roles in urban areas, making them actually more powerful contributors to the household livelihood and the economy, but actually much more vulnerable to violence within the household and violence within the community. So I think the need constantly to think and rethink and act on vulnerability in all its dimensions is absolutely crucial. And then the other side of the coin, I think, is the issue of agency, which I mentioned and is a kind of theme in the report, but really a challenge, particularly in Chapter 6, to reconfigure humanitarian situations as development opportunities. It's not a popular thesis that sort of disaster is a development opportunity, forced migration is a development opportunity, but if we were to find ways of reframing the way humanitarians perceive and act, and the kind of the dichotomy of funding, there's a humanitarian budget and developmental budget. If we could find ways of getting humanitarian actors to think more like developmentalists and developmentalists to think more like humanitarian actors, I think that would resonate so much more powerfully with the agency and the capacity, resources, resilience of the people who are all there to try and support in our different ways, whether it's researchers or field program managers or what have you.
Thanks, Roger. Finally, Sarah.
And Roger has anticipated what I was going to focus on, because I think the report actually really brings to life the importance of bringing together the two communities in a range of different areas. You know, I mentioned about forced migration in urban context, the protracted displacement, and even the development-induced displacement. All of those speak to the importance of bringing together the two communities to address displacement. And it's always struck me that it's the label that determines who responds, because particularly in urban context, if we call them urban poor, then it's the domain of the national actors or the development organizations. But if they are displaced, that is a humanitarian caseload. And to the person that is in the slum, it makes no difference who is there, And very often, actually, the response, to protracted displacement, to urban displacement, is in the development interventions that, governments can provide, in the policies that governments can determine around, work permits, around citizenship, around, access to land tenure, security, and so on. And I think it's really imperative that the two communities finally come together. I mean, it's on a number of these issues where this needs to happen, but especially around providing response to displacement, it is essential that humanitarian actors understand that the answer, the long-term solution to these vulnerabilities, is in national interventions and development interventions, and on the side of the development actors, that there are protection issues, that there are specific, dimensions where humanitarian expertise needs to be brought in to respond adequately to these situations.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to the panel. I'm sure we could go on discussing and sharing our own views on perspectives on this important issue for many hours to come. And I would really commend this report. I think it's an excellent study and contribution, and it is a call to action, and I would really hope that all of us can respond to that call in different ways that we would within our own spheres that we work in, and that the report would make a positive contribution towards this subject of forced migration, and ultimately really have an impact towards the dignity and safety and resilience of vulnerable migrants. Thank you to the panel, thank you to all of you for participating, and have a very good afternoon.